Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The dull hum of the newsroom had long since become background noise for Emily Ward. As she stared at the assignment sheet in front of her, her editor's voice droned on, detailing the expectations of her next big story. Kane Enterprises, the crown jewel of corporate America, had been making headlines for years, lavish success stories coupled with whispers of something darker beneath the surface. Tax fraud, embezzlement, insider trading, rumors swirled, but nothing had ever stuck. "Emily, this is a career-defining opportunity," her editor said, leaning forward with the intensity of a seasoned journalist who had seen too many uncracked stories. "We need someone on the inside. That's you." Emily nodded, masking her apprehension. Undercover work wasn't new to her, but this was different. Kane Enterprises wasn't just another faceless corporation. It was a fortress of power run by Ethan Kane, a man whose name carried an aura of both reverence and fear. The company's gala was held in the grand ballroom of a downtown luxury hotel, an event so exclusive that even the most elite journalists found invitations elusive. Emily had spent days rehearsing her role as a new marketing consultant, a fabricated persona created with the help of forged credentials and a cover story that was practically airtight. The moment she stepped inside, the opulence of the room threatened to overwhelm her senses. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in warm light, and the faint scent of expensive champagne mingled with designer perfumes. Power players moved seamlessly between conversations, their laughter calculated and polite. "Ms. Harper," a firm, rich voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily turned to find herself face-to-face with Ethan Kane. She was struck first by his presence. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an undeniable air of authority. His sharp navy suit fit perfectly, accentuating his lean frame. But it was his eyes, icy blue and piercing, that held her captive. "Yes," she replied, offering her hand with practiced ease. "Megan Harper. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kane." His handshake was firm but not aggressive. "I wasn't expecting to meet our newest consultant here, but I admire the initiative." Emily smiled, careful to project confidence. "I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to immerse myself in the company culture. Kane Enterprises has such a strong reputation." His lips curved into a faint smile, though his gaze remained assessing. "And what part of our culture are you most drawn to, Ms. Harper?" Emily's heart raced. She couldn't afford to stumble now. "The innovation, of course. It's rare to find a company that balances ambition with results so seamlessly. It's something I've admired from a distance for a long time." He chuckled softly, the sound low and almost disarming. Spoken like someone who knows how to make an impression. Their conversation was brief, but it left a lingering impact. Throughout the night, Emily felt his presence, even when they weren't speaking. She caught him watching her during her interactions with others, his gaze steady and unreadable. By the end of the evening, she had achieved her first goal, planting herself firmly on Ethan Kane's radar. But as she rode the elevator back to her modest apartment, a wave of unease washed over her. This was no ordinary assignment. Ethan Kane wasn't just charming. He was dangerous. For the first time, Emily questioned whether her ambition had led her too close to the fire. Emily's first week at Kane Enterprises was a whirlwind of orientation sessions, tightly scheduled meetings, and the ever-present weight of Ethan Kane's silent scrutiny. The open-concept office hummed with activity, but there was an unspoken hierarchy that was impossible to ignore. At the top was Ethan, a figure who seemed both omnipresent and unreachable. Emily worked from a sleek glass desk in the marketing department, her supposed area of expertise. Every detail of her fabricated resume had been carefully tailored to withstand scrutiny, and so far, her colleagues seemed to accept her presence without question. But Ethan was different. "Ms. Harper, a word?" The low, commanding voice startled her as she typed up a draft campaign proposal, one of many tasks designed to help her blend in. Looking up, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway to his office. He didn't wait for her reply, simply turned and strode inside, expecting her to follow. Emily smoothed her skirt, grabbed her notepad, and entered the lion's den. Ethan's office was a testament to his power, minimalist, yet luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and a single piece of abstract art dominated the wall behind his mahogany desk. Ethan leaned against the edge of that desk now, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. "Close the door," he said. The soft click of the latch seemed to echo in the silent room. "Is everything all right?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes seemed to study her, peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed facade. "Your proposal," he said, holding up the printed draft she'd submitted earlier that morning. "It's interesting." Emily's heart raced. Had she miscalculated? Had her writing or ideas betrayed her lack of real marketing experience? "I appreciate the creative approach," he continued, his voice calm but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "But you seem to have a way of thinking outside the company's usual parameters. Where did you learn that?" "I've always believed that innovation requires risk," she replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning within her. "Sometimes you have to challenge the norms to find what really works." Ethan's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "A bold philosophy. Is that a bad thing here?" she countered, daring to meet his gaze. His eyes held hers, and for a moment, the tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just professional. It was personal, charged with an unspoken challenge. "No," he said finally, his tone softening, "but it can be dangerous." The meeting ended soon after, but the memory of Ethan's words stayed with Emily long after she left his office. There had been something in his demeanor, an intensity that unnerved her, even as it drew her in. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the research files she had meticulously compiled. Ethan Kane wasn't just another CEO. His reputation as a brilliant businessman was matched only by the whispers of his ruthlessness. Employees spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a man who demanded perfection and tolerated no betrayal. Emily told herself she was imagining things. He couldn't possibly suspect her real purpose at the company, at least not yet. But the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to strip away her defenses with a single glance, made her wonder. A few days later, the tension escalated. Ethan appeared unexpectedly at her desk, drawing curious glances from her colleagues. "Ms. Harper, I'd like you to sit in on the leadership meeting this afternoon. Your perspective could be useful." Her perspective? She was supposed to be an entry-level consultant. This was far outside the norm, and she knew it. Still, she nodded, hiding her nerves behind a polite smile. "Of course. I'll be there." The meeting was held in a sleek conference room on the executive floor. Ethan led the discussion, his commanding presence dominating the room. Emily sat quietly at first, taking notes and observing the power dynamics at play. But then Ethan turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Ms. Harper, what's your take on the proposed restructuring plan?" Her breath caught. She hadn't been briefed on the plan beforehand, and the question felt deliberately pointed. Was he testing her? Summoning every ounce of composure, she replied, "I think the plan has merit, but it may benefit from a more targeted approach to consumer engagement. If we emphasize personalization in our marketing strategies, we could see stronger returns." The room fell silent. For a moment, she thought she had overstepped. But then Ethan nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Interesting perspective," he said. "We'll explore that further." As the meeting concluded, Emily gathered her things, relieved to escape without further scrutiny. But as she reached the door, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Ms. Harper, a moment." She turned to find him standing close, too close. "You continue to surprise me," he said, his tone low and unreadable. "I'll be keeping a closer eye on your work." Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. She knew his words carried a double meaning. Ethan Kane was watching her, and he wasn't the kind of man to miss anything. The elevator doors slid open, and Emily stepped inside, clutching her tablet and a folder filled with notes from the day's meetings. She was focused, her mind churning with how to balance her dual roles, employee and undercover investigator. "Hold the elevator," a deep voice called. She instinctively pressed the button, and a moment later, Ethan Kane stepped in. The scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of cedar and spice, filled the small space, and Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Late night?" he asked, glancing at the folder in her hands. "Trying to keep up?" she replied with a polite smile. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. For a moment, there was silence, thick and heavy. She could feel Ethan's gaze on her, sharp and penetrating. "You've made quite an impression in a short time, Miss Harper," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Kane." She kept her tone professional, but the compliment stirred something in her. A mixture of pride and apprehension. The elevator jolted suddenly, coming to an abrupt halt between floors. The lights flickered, then dimmed to an emergency glow. Emily's breath caught. What just happened? Ethan pressed the emergency call button. "Elevator stuck," he said calmly after speaking briefly with building maintenance. "They'll have it running again in a few minutes." She nodded, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. The confined space felt smaller with every passing second. "You don't strike me as someone who panics easily," Ethan observed, leaning casually against the wall. Emily forced a smile. "I don't. Usually." His lips curved into a faint smirk. "Good. Panic rarely solves anything." The elevator remained still, the air between them charged. Emily adjusted her position, shifting her weight, and her elbow brushed against his arm. The contact was brief, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping back slightly. "No need to apologize," he replied, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "I don't mind." She glanced up at him and their eyes met. For a moment, the world outside the elevator ceased to exist. There was something magnetic about his gaze, an intensity that seemed to pull her closer, even though every rational part of her screamed to keep her distance. The small space amplified the tension between them. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint rhythm of his breath. "Tell me something, Miss Harper," he said, breaking the silence. "What drives you?" The question caught her off guard. "Excuse me? Everyone has a reason for what they do," he continued, his tone measured. "Ambition, fear, desire. What's yours?" Emily hesitated. The truth, the need to uncover his secrets and expose the corruption of Kane Enterprises, was not an option. Instead, she chose a carefully crafted answer. "I suppose it's curiosity," she said. "I like to understand how things work, why people make the choices they do." Ethan nodded, as if her answer intrigued him. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "Only if you let it be," she replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And do you let it be, Miss Harper?" The elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered back to full brightness. The movement broke the spell between them, and a moment later, the doors slid open. Ethan gestured for her to exit first, and as she stepped into the hallway, she felt the cool air hit her flushed skin. "Good night, Miss Harper," he said, his tone neutral once more. "Good night, Mr. Kane." As she walked away, she felt his gaze linger on her, burning into her back. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The accidental touch, the charged silence. It was as though an invisible thread now connected them, pulling tighter with every interaction. That night, as she sat in her apartment, Emily replayed the elevator incident in her mind. She told herself it was nothing, that the proximity and the circumstances had created an illusion of intimacy. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Ethan Kane wasn't just her target. He was becoming something far more complicated. The invitation came as a surprise. Emily had just finished a report in the open plan office when her email pinged. The subject line was simple: dinner invitation. She opened it to find a message from Ethan Kane himself, short and to the point. "Ms. Harper, I'd like to discuss your thoughts on the restructuring plan over dinner. Tonight, 8 p.m. at Le Jardin. Let my assistant know if this works for you. Ethan Kane." Her heart skipped a beat. Le Jardin was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, a place where deals were made and power exchanged hands. It wasn't the sort of venue chosen for casual business discussions. Professional, she reminded herself. This is professional. But even as she repeated the words, the memory of their previous interactions lingered. His lingering gaze, the accidental touch, the unspoken tension that seemed to hum between them. By the time she arrived at Le Jardin, Emily had prepared herself as best she could. She wore a sleek black dress, understated yet elegant, paired with a simple necklace that glimmered faintly under the restaurant's soft lighting. The maitre d' greeted her with practiced deference, leading her to a private table tucked away in the corner. Ethan was already there, his tailored suit impeccable, his expression calm yet intense. "Ms. Harper," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you for joining me." "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. As they sat, a waiter appeared almost immediately, offering wine recommendations. Ethan ordered for both of them, his confidence unshakable. It was clear he was a man used to being in control. The first few minutes of conversation were safe, work-focused, revolving around strategies and ideas for the restructuring plan. But as the evening progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. "You're full of surprises, Ms. Harper," Ethan said, swirling his wine. Emily raised an eyebrow. "How so? You're not like the others." "The others? The ones who come here eager to impress," he explained. "They all say what they think I want to hear. But you challenge me. You see things differently." She smiled, careful to keep it measured. "Maybe I just don't know any better." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on hers. "I don't believe that for a second." The air between them grew heavy, the conversation dipping into something far more personal. He asked her about her background, her motivations, her dreams. She responded cautiously, weaving her answers into the framework of her fabricated identity. But Ethan had a way of probing deeper, of asking questions that made her feel as though he could see through her carefully constructed facade. As the main course was cleared away, Ethan shifted the conversation again. "What about outside of work?" he asked. "What keeps you grounded?" Emily hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "I suppose I try to find balance," she said. "Work is important, but so is finding time for yourself." "And have I what?" "Found time for yourself," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Or do you bury yourself in work to avoid what's missing?" The question felt uncomfortably close to the truth. She thought of Mark, her husband, and the growing distance between them. Her cover story made it easy to deflect questions about her personal life, but the reality was harder to ignore. "I think we all have things we're searching for," she said carefully. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps." By the time dessert arrived, the tone of the evening had shifted completely. The conversation was no longer about work or pleasantries. It was layered with unspoken tension, a push and pull of words and glances. As they finished their meal, Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You intrigue me, Ms. Harper," he said. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is," he replied. "But it's also dangerous." There it was again, that word, spoken with a subtle weight that sent a shiver down her spine. He stood, offering her his hand to help her from her seat. The touch was brief but electric, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. "I'll have my driver take you home," he said as they reached the restaurant's entrance. "That's not necessary," she replied quickly. "I insist," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The sleek black car waiting outside was as impeccably maintained as everything else in Ethan Kane's world. As she slid into the back seat, she couldn't help but notice the faint imprint of his cologne on her skin, a reminder of how close they'd been. The ride home was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine. When she arrived at her apartment, she paused in the dimly lit hallway, her mind racing. The evening had been far more intimate than she'd anticipated. Ethan Kane wasn't just a target anymore. He was a storm, drawing her into his orbit with a force she was struggling to resist. And for the first time since taking the assignment, Emily wondered if she was losing control. Emily tried to focus on her work the next morning, but her mind was clouded with thoughts of the previous night. Ethan Kane had a way of pulling her in, disarming her, making her forget why she was really there. She hated how easily he could slip past her defenses. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was an internal message. Ethan Kane, Ms. Harper, my office. Now, she sighed, smoothing her skirt before heading to the executive floor. Ethan's office was as imposing as ever. When she entered, he was standing by the window, his back to her, the city skyline stretching out before him. You wanted to see me? She asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He turned, his expression unreadable. Close the door. Her fingers hesitated on the handle, but she obeyed, the soft click echoing in the silence. I need your input on something, he said, gesturing for her to join him by the window. She approached cautiously, standing beside him. The proximity was unnerving. She could feel the heat of his body, the subtle tension in the air. It's about the restructuring plan, he continued, his tone professional. But his eyes betrayed something else, a lingering intensity that made her pulse quicken. Emily forced herself to focus, offering suggestions and counterpoints, but it was difficult to concentrate with him so close. His gaze never left her, and she could feel it like a physical weight. At one point, she gestured toward a document on the desk, leaning slightly to reach it. She didn't realize how close he was until her shoulder brushed against his. Sorry, she murmured, stepping back. He didn't move, his eyes locking on hers. You apologize too often, he said, his voice softer now. Her breath hitched. The room felt smaller, the air charged. She tried to step away, but his hand shot out, gently catching her wrist. Ethan, she began, her voice faltering. Do you know how hard it is to ignore you? He asked, his tone low, almost a whisper. To pretend I don't notice every time you walk into the room? Her heart raced, panic and desire warring within her. This isn't. Tell me to stop, he said, his gaze searching hers. And I will. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him this was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself frozen, caught in the storm of his presence. Ethan stepped closer, his hand moving from her wrist to her face, his fingers brushing her cheek. I should let you go, he murmured. Then do it, she whispered, though her voice betrayed the truth. She didn't want him to. He didn't. The first kiss was tentative, almost questioning, but it quickly deepened as months of tension erupted between them. His lips were warm and insistent, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer. Emily knew this was wrong. She knew every moment was a betrayal, not just to her husband, Mark, but to herself and the mission she was supposed to be completing. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his shirt. He pressed her back against the desk, his mouth trailing from her lips to her jawline, then to her neck. You drive me insane, he murmured against her skin. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt, and before she could think better of it, she was undoing them one by one. The world outside ceased to exist. His hands explored her body, sliding beneath the fabric of her blouse, and she gasped at the sensation of his touch. She knew she should stop, that she was crossing a line she could never uncross. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the way he made her feel. Desired, alive, reckless. Their movements grew more urgent, each kiss more fervent than the last. Clothes fell away piece by piece, forgotten on the office floor. Ethan lifted her onto the desk, his strength both startling and thrilling, and their bodies came together in a rush of heat and need. For Emily, time seemed to blur. The only things she could focus on were the feel of his hands, the taste of his lips, the intensity of his gaze as he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Afterward, the room was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Ethan leaned back against the desk, his shirt still unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. Emily adjusted her skirt, her mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. "This changes things," he said finally. She looked at him, unsure of how to respond. "It was a mistake," she said, though the words felt hollow. He stood, closing the distance between them. "Was it?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, as Emily lay in her bed, the guilt began to settle in. She thought of Mark, of the vows they had made. She thought of her assignment, the mission she was supposed to be completing. And she thought of Ethan. The way he had looked at her, the way he had touched her. For the first time in her career, Emily felt completely out of her depth. Emily told herself it wouldn't happen again. The moment she left Ethan's office, she vowed to draw a firm line between them. But that promise lasted barely a day. Their next meeting came unexpectedly. She was working late, poring over documents in one of the glass-walled conference rooms, when Ethan appeared. His presence was magnetic as always, and before she could offer an excuse to leave, he closed the door behind him. "You've been avoiding me," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been working," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He smirked, the kind of expression that made her stomach twist. "You think I can't tell the difference?" Her pulse quickened as he stepped closer. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked, his tone soft but dangerous. "This," she said, gesturing between them. "Whatever this is." He tilted his head, studying her. "You keep saying that, but you're still here. So tell me, Emily, why haven't you walked away?" The truth was, she didn't know. Ethan Kane had a pull she couldn't resist, a way of making her forget everything. Her assignment, her marriage, her own moral compass. And it didn't stop there. After that night, their encounters became a routine. It started with subtle glances in meetings, lingering looks that carried unspoken promises. Then came the stolen moments. His hand brushing hers as they passed in the hallway, whispered words exchanged in secluded corners. Before long, those moments turned into something more. One evening, as Emily packed up her things, her phone buzzed. "Ethan Kane, my place. 9 p.m. She stared at the message, torn between obligation and desire. She knew she should ignore it, that every time she gave in, she was digging herself deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. But at 9 p.m., she found herself standing outside his penthouse apartment, her heart pounding as she knocked on the door. Ethan opened it himself, dressed casually in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone. The sight of him sent a rush of heat through her, and she cursed herself for being so weak. "You came," he said, his lips curving into that infuriating smirk. "You didn't leave me much choice," she replied, stepping inside. The penthouse was as sleek and modern as she'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But she barely had time to take it in before Ethan closed the door and pulled her into his arms. Their relationship quickly escalated. They met in secret, their passion growing more intense with each encounter. Ethan's penthouse became their sanctuary, a place where they could shed the masks they wore in the office. But the secrecy only added to the thrill and the danger. Emily began making excuses to Mark, staying late at work or inventing networking events to explain her absences. She hated lying to him, but the guilt was drowned out by the intoxicating rush of being with Ethan. Their meetings weren't just physical, though that was a large part of it. Ethan challenged her, drew her into conversations that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He asked questions that cut to the core of who she was, forcing her to confront parts of herself she'd long ignored. And yet, she knew it couldn't last. One night, as they lay tangled in the sheets of Ethan's bed, he traced a finger along her arm. "Tell me something," he said. She turned to face him, her chest tightening at the intensity of his gaze. "What? Why are you really here?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "You're not like the others, Emily. You're not here for the paycheck or the prestige. So what is it?" Her breath hitched. Did he suspect? Had she been too careless? "I guess I'm trying to figure that out myself," she said, deflecting as best she could. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting her answer, for now. But the cracks were starting to show. At work, the secrecy became harder to maintain. Sophia Greer, a rival journalist, had been sniffing around Kane Enterprises for weeks, her questions growing more pointed. "Something big is happening there," Sophia said one evening over drinks. "I can feel it." Emily forced a laugh. "I think you're giving them too much credit." But the truth was, Sophia's instincts weren't wrong. And every time Emily met with Ethan, every time she let herself be consumed by him, she felt the walls closing in. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave Ethan's apartment, he caught her by the wrist. "Stay," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I can't," she replied, pulling away. "Why not?" "Because I have a husband. Because I'm lying to you. Because this is all going to fall apart." But she couldn't say any of that. Instead, she forced a smile and said, "You know why?" Ethan didn't push, but as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was starting to see through her. And she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Emily sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen, her stomach twisting into knots. Subject: "We need to talk. I know what you've been up to. Meet me at Rivertown Cafe, 7 p.m. Don't make me come to you." The message was unsigned, but the implications were crystal clear. Someone knew about her affair with Ethan. Worse, they were threatening to expose her. She read the message again, trying to quell the rising panic. Could it be Sophia Greer? The ambitious rival journalist had been circling Kane Enterprises like a shark for weeks. Or perhaps it was someone within the company, an assistant, an intern, anyone who might have caught wind of her secret meetings with Ethan. "Everything okay?" Ethan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway of her office, his brow furrowed in concern. "Yes," she lied quickly, minimizing the window. "Just a lot on my plate." He studied her for a moment, as if sensing something was wrong, but he didn't press. By 7 p.m., Emily found herself at Rivertown Cafe, her nerves frayed. She scanned the small, dimly lit space until her eyes landed on a familiar figure seated in the corner. "Mark?" she whispered, her heart dropping. Her husband looked up from his coffee, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. "Sit down," he said. Emily hesitated, her legs feeling like lead, but she obeyed, sliding into the chair across from him. "How did you—" she began, but the words faltered. "Figure it out?" Mark's tone was sharp. "I've known something was wrong for weeks. The late nights, the lies. I just didn't want to believe it." She swallowed hard. "Mark, don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I saw the text messages, Emily. The ones from Ethan Kane. You didn't even bother deleting them." Her blood ran cold. She'd been so careful, or so she thought. "I wanted to hear it from you," he continued. "I wanted you to tell me the truth. But instead, I had to find out like this." "Mark, I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you." "Hurt me?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even realize what you've done? To me? To us?" Emily tried to explain, but the words felt hollow. How could she justify the unjustifiable? How could she tell him that what started as a mission had spiraled into something she could no longer control? "You know what the worst part is?" Mark said, his voice breaking. "I thought we were happy. I thought we had a good life." "We did," she whispered. "We do." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not anymore." He stood, throwing a few bills onto the table. "I hope he was worth it." As he walked away, Emily felt the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. She had destroyed the one thing she thought she could always rely on. But the nightmare was only beginning. The next day, Emily received another email. Subject: "You're not safe. I know everything. You've been lying to him. And to Ethan. I want $50,000 by Friday. Leave it in locker 319 at Grand Central. No tricks or I'll destroy you." Emily stared at the screen, her hands shaking. The sender was anonymous, but the message was clear. Someone was blackmailing her. Her mind raced. Who could it be? Was it Mark seeking revenge? Or someone else entirely? And how had they learned the truth? She thought about going to Ethan, but the idea made her stomach turn. If he found out about the blackmail, he would start asking questions. Questions she couldn't answer without revealing the full extent of her deception. For the first time, she felt completely cornered. The following evening, Ethan invited her to his penthouse for what he described as a celebration. A major deal had gone through, and he wanted to mark the occasion. Emily almost declined, but the risk of raising his suspicions was too great. When she arrived, she found him in high spirits, a bottle of champagne already open on the kitchen counter. "To new beginnings," he said, handing her a glass. She smiled weakly, the weight of the blackmail email pressing down on her. "To new beginnings," she echoed, but Ethan's sharp eyes caught her hesitation. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting his glass down. "Nothing," she lied. "Just tired." He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "You're not a good liar, Emily." The words sent a chill through her. Did he know? Had the blackmailer reached out to him as well? "I'm fine," she insisted, forcing a smile. But Ethan didn't look convinced. As the evening wore on, Emily struggled to keep up appearances. The warmth and ease that usually defined their time together were gone, replaced by a tension that neither of them acknowledged. When she finally left, she felt a wave of relief. But as she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed with another message. "You're running out of time." Emily clutched the phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was trapped, the walls closing in on all sides. She knew she couldn't keep this up much longer, and she had no idea how to escape. The world as Emily knew it began to crumble on a cold Friday afternoon. She had spent the past 2 days agonizing over the blackmailer's demands, scrambling to gather the money while desperately trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy at work and home. Every glance from Ethan felt scrutinizing, every silence suffocating. At 4:30 p.m., her phone buzzed with a new email. Subject: surprise. Locker 319 wasn't empty. Nice try. Her heart sank. She had left the money in the locker just as instructed. An old duffel bag filled with cash she had painstakingly withdrawn from savings and borrowed from whatever sources she could. She had hoped that would be the end of it. But the nightmare was far from over. By the time Ethan called her into his office that evening, she already felt the storm brewing. His tone had been curt over the intercom, and when she entered, his expression was icy. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Emily obeyed, her hands gripping her lap to keep them from trembling. Ethan sat back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes locked on her. He reached for his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. "Care to explain this?" Her stomach plummeted. On the screen was a series of photos, grainy but unmistakable. Images of her leaving Grand Central Station, clutching the duffel bag. Images of her meeting the blackmailer. "Ethan, I can explain." "Explain." His voice was sharp, cutting through her feeble attempt at words. "You were carrying $50,000 in cash to some mystery man at Grand Central. And that's not even the worst part." Her heart pounded in her chest as he tapped the screen again, bringing up a new set of images. This time they were of her and Ethan. Outside his penthouse, inside his office, even a candid shot of them sharing a kiss in a darkened hallway. "Someone's been watching us," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emily's world tilted. She could barely breathe, the weight of the revelations pressing down on her. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Ethan cut her off, his anger barely contained. "You've been lying to me since the day you walked through that door, haven't you?" "Ethan, please let me explain." "Then start talking," he said, leaning forward, his expression cold. "Because right now, the only thing keeping me from throwing you out of here is the fact that I'm still trying to figure out why the hell I trusted you in the first place." Emily's mind raced, searching for an answer that could salvage the situation. But there was no salvaging this. Her cover had been blown, her lies laid bare. "I was assigned to investigate Kane Enterprises," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Investigate. For a story," she said, the words tumbling out. "I'm a journalist. My editor sent me undercover to look into allegations of corruption." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood, his hands braced on the edge of the desk as he stared down at her. "So, this entire time," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you've been using me?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "Ethan, I swear." "Don't," he snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare lie to me again." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening further. "Perfect," he muttered. "Just when I thought this couldn't get worse." He tapped the screen and a video began to play. It was footage from a hidden camera. Grainy but clear enough to show Emily and Ethan in his penthouse, their bodies tangled together on the couch. "It's public now," he said, his voice bitter. "Whoever's behind this just sent it to every major news outlet in the city. Congratulations, Emily. You've officially ruined both of us." Her blood ran cold. "No." "Yes," he said, his tone harsh. "And now the board is breathing down my neck. My personal life is plastered across every tabloid, and my reputation is in shreds. All because of you." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I never wanted this to happen. But it did," he said, his voice softening slightly, though the anger in his eyes remained. "And now we're both paying the price." Emily left his office in a daze, her mind reeling. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. She had lost everything. Her assignment, her marriage, and now, the fragile connection she had forged with Ethan. And as the headlines exploded with scandalous details of their affair, she realized the fallout had only just begun. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within hours of the leaked footage, the media frenzy erupted like wildfire. News outlets ran salacious headlines detailing the affair, accompanied by the grainy images of Emily and Ethan together. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, each one a stark reminder of how far her world had spiraled out of control. Mark had called once. The voicemail he left was brief, cold, and final. "We're done, Emily. Don't come home." She hadn't expected forgiveness, but hearing those words still cut deep. Ethan, however, was another story. She hadn't spoken to him since the confrontation in his office. Her repeated attempts to reach him had gone unanswered, and she couldn't decide if his silence was a blessing or a curse. The next time she saw him, it wasn't by choice. Emily was sitting at a small cafe, nursing a cup of coffee she had no appetite for, when Ethan walked in. He spotted her immediately, his expression unreadable as he made his way to her table. "Ethan," she began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "We need to talk," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. She nodded, her chest tightening. "I didn't know the footage would leak. I swear." "Save it," he interrupted, his tone clipped. "This isn't about the footage. This is about us. Or whatever it is you think we were." His words stung, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I never meant to hurt you." "Hurt me?" He laughed bitterly. "Emily, you didn't just hurt me. You used me, lied to me, made me look like a fool." "That wasn't my intention," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened between us was a mistake," he said, cutting her off. "A mistake I won't make again." Emily felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill. "You meant something to me, Ethan. This wasn't just an assignment." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't try to spin this into something it wasn't. You lied to me from the start, Emily. That's all I'll ever be to you. An assignment." "That's not true," she protested. "Isn't it?" he shot back. "You knew what you were doing. You knew the risks. And now we're both paying for your choices." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. He was right. No matter how much she wanted to justify her actions, the truth was undeniable. She had betrayed him, just as she had betrayed Mark. "Do you know what the board said this morning?" Ethan continued, his voice low and angry. They want me out. My own company. Years of building this empire, and it's all crumbling because of you. I never wanted this to happen, she whispered. But it did, he said, his tone softening slightly. And now there's no going back. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. This is over, Emily. Whatever we had, it's done. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his. Ethan, please. Don't, he said, pulling away. I don't want to see you again. With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her alone with the weight of her guilt and regret. Emily stayed in the cafe long after Ethan left, replaying his words over and over in her mind. She had destroyed everything. Her marriage, her career, her relationship with Ethan. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what came next. The courtroom was cold and clinical, the fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glare over every surface. Emily sat at the defendant's table, her attorney flipping through a thick stack of papers with the focus of a surgeon preparing for a delicate procedure. Across the aisle, Mark sat with his lawyer, his posture stiff, his face set in a mask of quiet fury. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. As the proceedings began, Emily felt as though she were watching her life unravel from a distance. This case is about betrayal, Mark's attorney began, his voice steady but cutting. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of vows, and betrayal of financial obligations. My client has been humiliated, his career jeopardized, and his financial security threatened, all because of the defendant's actions. Emily's chest tightened as the attorney outlined the details of her affair with Ethan Kane. The footage, the leaked photos, the blackmail, it was all laid bare in excruciating detail. When it was her attorney's turn, he tried to redirect the narrative, painting Emily as a woman who had made a mistake but had been manipulated by circumstances beyond her control. But the damage was already done. Mark had requested a divorce on grounds of adultery, and the evidence left little room for negotiation. He wasn't just asking for a clean break. He was seeking financial retribution. Your Honor, Mark's attorney continued, my client has supported the defendant throughout their marriage, even while she pursued her career. He provided stability, trust, and financial backing. And how did she repay him? By engaging in an affair that has now tarnished his reputation and jeopardized his standing in the legal community. Mark's face remained stoic, but Emily could see the hurt in his eyes. The most painful moment came when Mark took the stand. I loved my wife, he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. I trusted her. I believed in her. And she threw it all away. For what? A fling with her boss? A chance to destroy everything we built together. Emily stared at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. What do you hope to achieve with this divorce? Mark's attorney asked. Closure, Mark said simply, and to make sure she takes responsibility for what she's done. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling. I hurt the people I care about the most, and I can't undo that. All I can do is take responsibility and try to move forward. Her words felt hollow even to her. The judge's expression remained impassive, offering no indication of what impact, if any, they had made. The verdict came swiftly. The judge granted the divorce on Mark's terms, awarding him a significant portion of their shared assets. Emily would be left with little more than her personal belongings and the remnants of her professional reputation, which had been decimated by the media frenzy surrounding her affair. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of their marriage, Emily felt a profound emptiness settle over her. The weeks that followed were a blur. She moved into a small, sparsely furnished apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the life she had once known. The emails from her editor stopped coming. The few friends she had tried to reach out to responded with polite but distant messages, clearly uncomfortable with her new notoriety. She thought about Ethan often, wondering if he had managed to salvage his career, or if he blamed her as much as she blamed herself. Mark didn't contact her again. She couldn't blame him. One afternoon, as she unpacked a box of books, her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from an anonymous address, the subject line blank. The message contained a single line. "Are you ready to tell the truth?" Her stomach clenched as she stared at the screen. Whoever had orchestrated the blackmail was still out there, still pulling strings. But this time, Emily felt no fear. She had already lost everything. If the truth was all she had left, then perhaps it was time to let it out. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.